Please use the chat feature set to organizers and panelists only to send in your questions, or if you need to let us know that you're having technical difficulties. All questions will be saved until after the panelists have spoken. Specify to which presenter you'd like your question directed, just so our moderators can be sure to pose it to the correct presenter. And it'd be great if you could send your questions in as we go instead of waiting until the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. Please give us your feedback so we can continually improve our webinar offerings. And you'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar and to the slides. Our moderator today is Michael Clark, president of Clark & Company. Michael's experience spans both the publishing and software industries with a focus on developing, delivering, and marketing information products for professionals. Prior to founding Clark & Company, he worked at Silverchair, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the University of Chicago Press. He holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree from the University of Colorado. Mike will be joined today by David Crotty, Editorial Director, Journals Policy at Oxford University Press, and editor and head chef of the Scholarly Kitchen. It's now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Michael so he can introduce our panel and get us underway.
Thank you, Tim. This is Michael Clark, and I would like to first thank our moderator. I'm sorry? I would like to introduce our moderator today, as well as our two speakers, and thank them for participating. Moderator is, as Tim mentioned, David Crotty, who is Editorial Director of Journals Policy for Oxford University Press, where he oversees journal policy and contributes to strategy across OUP's journal program, drives technological innovation, serves as an information officer, and manages a suite of research society-owned journals. David is also executive editor of the Society for Scholarly Publishing Scholarly Kitchen blog and regularly writes about current issues in publishing. Our first speaker today will be Brooks Hansen, who's Director of Publications at the American Geophysical Union. Brooks serves as director where he is responsible for overseeing AGU's portfolio of many books and 19 journals and their editorial operations, where he also helps set overall editorial policies and leads future developments. Before arriving at AGU, he served as deputy editor for physical sciences at Science magazine and earlier as an editor at Science. Brooks has a PhD in geology from UCLA and held a postdoctoral appointment at the Department of Mineral Sciences, Smithsonian Institute. His main areas of research and publications span the tectonics of Western U.S., metamorphic petrology, modeling magnetism, hydrothermal processes, and, of course, scholarly publishing. Our second speaker today is Meg Byrne. Meg is a senior editor at Public Library of Science. She has a background in microbiology, molecular biology, and cell biology research, as well as medical writing. She began at PLOS ONE in 2012 as associate editor. Before joining PLOS, Megan worked as a medical writer at Motive Medical Intelligence, and she obtained a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of California at San Francisco, where she investigated how cells sense and adapt to changing environmental conditions, and she was also a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley. I will turn things over with that to Dr. Crotty.
Thanks, Michael. My grandmother's the only one who really calls me Dr. Crotty. But so we're going to have two presentations today, and then we're going to have a conversation. I know I have a lot of questions on this subject. I suspect you do too. So please, as the presentations go on, do send in questions so we can put them to our speakers. As an introduction, the data has rapidly become a new frontier in the world of scholarly publishing. Funding agencies, research institutions, researchers themselves are really recognizing the value and the importance of making research data available. Rather than just stuffing it into a filing cabinet and moving on to the next project, we're seeing an increased demand for putting that data out where others can put it to productive use. There are entire fields of research that are really rapidly growing, and they rely entirely on analyzing previously studied data sets, really just trying to mine them for new knowledge, getting more out of the work that's already been done. Data availability is also crucially important for increased demands for reproducibility and for transparency of research. So funders are beginning to require that researchers publicly release the data that their experiments generate, but they continue to struggle with the complexities that are involved. Policies that they're putting out requiring public or open access to research papers are pretty straightforward, and they're easy to accomplish in comparison. Data availability opens up a lot of complex questions around intellectual property, subject confidentiality, as well as basic questions around infrastructure like, well, where should I store this data and for how long? Or even more basic questions like, well, what do you mean by data? So scholarly publishing, as an industry, we're a service industry, and our job is to provide solutions for the needs of the academic community. And there's clearly a new need here, a new opportunity to be had in the realm of research data. But what should the role of a publisher be? Should we be building infrastructure? Should we be serving as a police force to monitor and enforce policies? Should we be acting in an editorial and a review role to ensure the integrity and the quality of data? I'm someone who's working with several journals that are trying to really drive data availability and requiring it, or at least encouraging it for authors. And I can tell you that the devil's in the details. There's a real complexity here in terms of policy and in terms of implementation that really does require a significant amount of attention. And that's why we've brought in our two speakers today, because they are both from organizations, and they're personally active in really being leaders in this area. So we're hoping to pick their brains a little bit and find out what we can learn from their experience. So I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker, Brooks Hansen, who will give his talk. Then Megan will speak, and then we'll have a conversation. So over to you, Brooks.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. All right, is everyone able to see my screen? Yes?
Yes, it looks great, Brooks.
Oh, it does. Okay, good. So we'll go back to that. Thank you.
Now you're at it. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, thanks. So as David said, what I'd like to do is overview some of the efforts, some of the experiences that we've learned on best practices in data sharing and how they work, and how to work with the researchers and authors, because that's absolutely key in developing a commitment for available data, and also provide a little bit of the history of how we dealt with that at AGU, and how publishers kind of are now getting together to not work separately, and there's actually a lot of resources and ability to work together on this. And that's important because authors and researchers are publishing in many journals, and part of the problem that is out there is there's confusion and different messages going out to authors and researchers. And to the extent that we can homogenize around best practices and provide kind of common messaging, I think that will ease a lot of the adoption problems that are happening. So very quickly, requiring access to data is not new. And actually, some journals go back even longer in this century requiring access to data. But just from example from AGU's point of view, AGU as a society first came up with a position statement on data in 1997. We've just updated it in 2015, but the very basic spirit of that remains. And the first data publication data policy was in 1993. The enforcement of that was a little bit more haphazard, but at least a position statement and policy statement was available then. Similarly, Science, Nature, PNAS, and other journals required protein structure deposition in the late 1990s, and quickly followed that with use of GenBank and other established domain repositories. And that those were absolute requirements and checked and were mandates at publication. And those journals, and actually many other journals, have been strengthening their data policies since then, sometimes in reaction to bad behavior or problems that came up. At Science, this included both a few issues of fraud and ClimateGate, among other things. But I put in some updates, major updates that happened, for example, at Science, and many of these were parallel going on in at least other leading journals. What's happened a bit new is the OSTP mandate and actually similar requirements emerging globally, Horizon 2020 in Europe, and other policies emerging from other nations, as well as a growing awareness, I think, in the scholarly publishing community that for our major roles of advancing science as well as in integrity, ensuring integrity of what we're publishing, that in many ways with modern science, data is as important as the scholarly record, and they have to go together for both of those major important functions. So what is new and what publishers and our partners are doing now, and partners are many kind of organizations, including like SSP, but also Force 11, a bunch of other organizations that involve publishers, are more and more requiring access to data. More are requiring access to software as well. Science and PNAS, as I mentioned, and Royal Society have had policies on that for some time. Nature just started requiring that this year. As David said, enforcement is occurring, but the devil is in the details, and I'll go into some of those details in a little bit. There are common best practices emerging around citing data, and just recently Force 11 came out with their software citation guidelines in draft form, so open for comment. And there are different requirements for software because there's, for example, different licensing best practices and other best practices. There's other common best practices emerging around data and other identifiers, ORCID obviously being one, and I'll talk about that very briefly. And a key part of this is there's various efforts emerging to extend awareness of these to researchers, and this is really an important part of making these work. It can't all be stick, it has to be working with the researchers to help them follow the best practices efficiently, and to make this more of a benefit rather than a burden. And it can be a benefit in that good data management has been shown quite widely to help science and help even the productivity of a lab. And new tools, and publishers are developing new tools to help make this as seamless as possible. There's a variety of efforts now developing new editorial workflows that include data dynamically. And also we need to help data repositories handle the data in the best possible way, and use those repositories, and encourage the use of those repositories that do that, and that provide other services around the data. And actually a key part of that might be helping in peer review, because in many cases the data repositories are the best to ensure at least some validation of quality of data. So what are the best practices? Force 11, and I'll show this in a little bit, came out with a joint declaration of data citation principles. These have been at least widely supported by journals. The basis of them is that data should be cited in the references as a reference whenever possible. They should not be in line in the text. Separate data publications are being increasingly encouraged when they're appropriate, when there is sufficient data to justify that, and many journals are emerging, and these are now being indexed to do this. Another best practice is some statement in the paper about transparency, about how researchers can access the data, even if it's obvious. Commonly, this is an acknowledgement. This has been shown to help awareness of authors of data policies as well. As I mentioned, a variety of other community identifiers are emerging that work just like DOIs, essentially, to help linkability and help discoverability and integrity of authors, funders, samples, author credit, and institutions, which still needs a little bit of shakedown. The use of trusted domain repositories, if they're available, GenBank is an example. PDB is another example. In the earth sciences, there's, for example, IRIS on seismologic data. Some journals, particularly I think Nature's been taking the lead on this, requiring the use of repositories that allow for data access during peer review, or essentially embargo data access during peer review. PDB has had that for some time, and a number of data repositories are have that capability or are rapidly developing that capability, and this is a partnership that publishers are having with at least leading repositories. If you are using supplements, there are NISO guidelines that have been out for several years now on those supplements. A couple other things that aren't often mentioned, but that are best practices, are that references should be in the main reference list, not in supplements. This is partly for indexing and discoverability and scholarly use of references. And also that key references and data should be available at the time of publication. This is so papers have, particularly for if they're data references or method references, that kind of the whole integrity of that paper is clear at the time of publication, not in some future promised state. As I mentioned, publishers and repositories are working together. Here's just some examples. There's others of these. There's the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines have now been endorsed by 538 journals. I showed a quick example of that in a minute. CopDesk I'll talk a little bit about, which is something we've been involved with and helping form as the Coalition on Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. There's a statement of commitment that was endorsed in early 2015 by most of the publishers and repositories in the Earth Sciences, Earth and Space Sciences. The Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles has been endorsed by over 100 organizations, including most publishers. AAAS and other organizations have been involved in a series of reproducibility conferences. Actually, one outcome of those conferences was the top guidelines. And DataCite and World Data Center and RDA and others have been involved in certification standards for repositories. So all that's really great. Where the publishers are having some challenges is it's kind of easy to endorse these principles. It's harder to put them into practice. So the top guidelines are a series of guidelines around transparency and reproducibility. There are 8 kind of standards, at least the first 4 or 5 apply broadly. Some of the others may be more specific to fields. For example, pre-registration of studies is hard in some cases in the earth sciences, where in many cases you don't know what you're going to discover until you find it. That's true in some other fields, but there's obviously other cases, clinical medicine and things like that, where the experiment is essentially defined well enough in advance that that's possible. This is just the website for the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles. Again, it's been widely endorsed, and a number of publishers are starting to put this in practice. I'll go through some of the ways that might happen briefly in a second. This is from participants or partly from DataCite, but there's a number of certification standards for repositories, and publishers should encourage kind of the best practice use of repositories that at least have the basic certification of a data seal of approval or ICSU World Data System certification. Very few repositories right now have ISO certification. It's a very strict standard. I mentioned the Coalition on Publishing Data in Earth and Space Sciences. There's a statement of commitment that's been widely endorsed, and we've worked with a number of organizations, including ORCID, to come up with joint best practices and starting to provide what we hope are common author statements that can be incorporated into author instructions, again, to help homogenize information that's going to authors across journals and help disseminate best practices. So some of those are on that website if you're interested. and those are related to a data policy statement, and we also link to many other data policy statements for other journals. Data citation using Force 11, the best practices, and we worked with DataCite on that, and Force 11 on that. Sample citation and identification in neurosciences on the funder identifying, and the ORCID text was provided by ORCID. So some best practices for data citation. As I mentioned, they should be treated as a reference in the references. Journals should instruct their copy editors to try to identify data citations that are in line and query authors about these to create citations. Similarly, should encourage authors to deposit relevant data sets in trusted repositories, or if not, general repositories such as Dryad, rather than a supplemental information. In the geosciences, we've developed a sample identifier, and we're trying to get that widely adopted. This allows linking of samples across papers, so it's just like you can link references or authors. It allows discovery of multiple analyses or multiple use of samples across papers. So the next steps. So as I mentioned, software citation standards have been released, and there's a number of efforts going on to now align those. And I expect that those will be adopted very shortly. A number of publishers were started requiring ORCID this year, and I believe the list that I have there is now larger. At AGU, we are starting 2 programs. I mentioned that kind of outreach to authors was particularly important, so we are starting a program to help authors in managing their data, or researchers in managing data. We've also started a program to help repositories adopt best practices in data management. Several of us have started a group associated with RDA to help provide more specific information on helping journals implement best practices. We hope to be working actually further with SSP and CSE, as well as individual societies, to help disseminate these best practices. And if anyone's interested, I'll be happy to share more information on that. Publishers, there's a similar group of publishers, not just CopDesk, but others, that are starting to work together on messaging to authors in author workshops around data. It's something many of us do. So the idea was to have some common slides and information to help homogenize the messaging and best practices. So just very quickly at the end, as David said, the devil is in the details. And here are some of the questions that we often receive about data. One is, what data are required, and do you really mean all of it? Usually the answer is no, because in many research streams, we're collecting a lot more data than we can keep. And the actual raw data are not what's useful. There might be counts coming off an instrument before a whole bunch of algorithms are done to remove background or homogenize to a background or remove interference and so forth. But usually the communities and repositories in some ways are the best example of what that is. So for example, for genomics data, GenBank kind of has a model for what data should be stored, not the, in fact, the raw reads coming off of sequencers are rarely kept. But in many cases, this is another reason to work with the communities, is they often have appropriate standards for data within a community. Enforcement of policies has to be engaged with your community. And it starts with a conversation also with the funding agencies, and is best done when data are collected. I know the National Academies is working on a revision of some of their guidelines for ethics and integrity in science, and further requirements or guidelines around data will be part of that. That should be out this year. Many journals, including AGU, are asking reviewers and editors about data availability specifically. There have been cases, more so when I was at Science than so far at AGU, where Editors had to get involved post-publication when data were not available. My experience is when that happened, the data became available. And rarely was a threat of retraction required. Many journals, including AGU, Science, have been doing this for several years, are holding or coordinating publications until all references are available. We get a lot of worries about someone stealing data or scooping research. Some of those are valid, some of those are urban legends. I think they're rarer than actually is feared. But widely adopted citation standards and norms should help that. And again, many communities have much experience in open data, and there are several studies of the benefit, the great benefit that it has for advancing science. The Kepler Space Telescope was one particular huge example of a great win for open data. And as David said, there's also still problems with both commercial and government, particularly some international government and even U.S. government laws on releasing of data. And that's why transparency and at least describing how the data can be accessed is important. Intellectual property can be okay. Data has not always been free. There's many data products used throughout scholarly publishing and material products where there's a cost for them, and I think we need to recognize that. But the cost is part of availability. And the key thing is to alert authors about data and access up front, and in negotiating transfer agreements if they're working with commercial groups. So I'll stop there. And so I think, Jennifer, are you going to, yep, great.
Super. So next up is Meg Byrne, Senior Editor at PLOS. Take it away, Meg.
Hi.
Thank you, Brooke.
So I'm going to talk about open data policies and the lessons we've learned from PLOS. So as David mentioned earlier, there's a growing consensus about the importance of data sharing from international organizations, government bodies, funding agencies, journal editors, and patients. One aspect of data availability that's receiving growing recognition is data stability. And a paper that was published in 2014 showed that the probability of finding the data associated with a paper declined by 17% every year, such that 20 years after a paper has been published, there's less than a 50% chance of being able to find the data underlying the findings. At PLOS, we feel that making data available fosters scientific progress. Data availability allows for the validation, replication, reanalysis, and new analysis of studies. It allows for reproducibility. It increases the value of research. It reduces the burden on authors in having to dig up data when they're asked to provide it after publication. It allows for easier citation of data. So PLOS has 7 journals, the largest of which is PLOS ONE and the widest in scope. And most of the information I'm going to be sharing with you is from PLOS ONE, but we found that it's representative of what we're seeing with the other journals. So PLOS's data policy is that all the journals require authors to make all data underlying the findings described in their manuscript fully available without restriction, with rare exception. And when submitting a manuscript online, authors must provide a data availability statement describing compliance with PLOS's policies. So that data availability statement needs to state where the underlying data can be found. And if the article is accepted for publication, the data availability statement is published as part of the final article. And this is a policy that we've had for over 2 years now, since March 2014. So what data are we asking for? So this policy applies to the data set that is used to reach the conclusions drawn in the manuscripts with related metadata and methods and any additional data needed to replicate the reported study findings in their entirety. So we do not ask authors to provide their entire data set if it's more data than what was used to reach the conclusions presented in the paper. Authors only need to provide the portion of their data set that is relevant to the specific study. So data points underlying averages, standard deviations that are presented in the paper. We do have exceptions to making data publicly available. In certain cases, it can be made available upon request. So if there are ethical or legal restrictions, for instance, patient confidentiality, ideally data access would be overseen by an ethics oversight committee or data access committee. Data from a third party, we recognize that if authors have obtained data from another group, they may not have the right to share that data publicly. And in those cases, we ask that authors make clear where the data have come from and to provide contact information so that other researchers can access the data in the same way. So where should the data be deposited? We accept data deposition in public repositories, and this is strongly recommended. And then in the data availability statement, we ask that authors specify the DOIs or accession numbers for the deposited data. We also will accept data in supporting information files, and we can accept up to about 100 megabytes of data per file. And then each supporting information file has its own DOI and is uploaded to Figshare. We also will accept data in the body of the manuscript, and this might be appropriate if the data set is small, for instance. This is an example of what the data availability statement looks like on a published paper. So it comes on the title page below the copyright information and above funding and competing interest information. This is an example of a paper where data were deposited to Dryad. Here's another example where authors have data in a few different repositories or a couple different repositories. So the data availability statement is openly available and machine readable as part of the PLOS Search API. And this is just showing that the URL in the data availability statement is linked to the database. So if you click on that, you get directed to the data that's been deposited. This is an example of data in supporting information. This is a paper that was published recently in PLOS ONE. And for this paper, the authors deposited the data or provided the data in the paper and the supporting information files. So if you go and look at the supporting information, you can see here that the authors have provided the underlying data points for their figures and tables in different tabs of an Excel spreadsheet. And the reader can download this Excel file. It's also uploaded to Figshare, and if you click there, you're taken to Figshare where the supporting information files are also deposited. And there they provide a nice citation information for people who may be accessing this data through Figshare. So up to now, we have published over 47,000 papers with the data availability statements. And the impact of the data policy that we've seen. So this is data from an analysis that was done just over 6 months after the data policy was implemented. So in this analysis, the authors looked at 51 papers that were published before the data policy was implemented, and then compared those to 20 papers published after the data policy. And they saw an increase in data sharing from 12% to 40%. So we're not seeing full compliance, and we still aren't, but we are seeing a significant improvement. So where are the data? And this is information from PLOS ONE, and it's an analysis of papers that were published between the second and fourth quarters of 2014 with papers published during that same time frame in 2015. So in 2014, we had just under 10,000 papers that were published with data availability statements. And of those, 74% had data in the submission file, so that means the manuscripts or supporting information. 11% had data deposited to repositories, and 10% had data available upon request. Then in 2015, there were 22,000 papers, approximately, published with data availability statements, and we saw a slight decrease in papers with data in the submission files, and an increase in papers with data deposited to repositories, which is not unexpected, since we do encourage authors to deposit data to repositories. And then just looking at some of the repositories that authors have used, we saw an increase in the percentage of papers that had data deposited to Dryad and Figshare. And we partner with Dryad to allow authors to deposit data at the time of submission, so that might contribute to that somewhat as well. There wasn't much change in deposition to NCBI databases, and then GitHub is another notable repository, and we saw a 100% increase in papers using, or authors using GitHub, but still those papers are less than 1% of the total papers published. So the data checks that we do comprise a check at submission for unacceptable restrictions. So there we're looking for cases in which authors cannot share or will not share their data, and they're not in compliance with our policy at all. And in those cases, we won't consider the paper further. And we've seen very few cases of this. Usually, authors are willing to work with us to share their data. So then during review, academic editors and reviewers assess the underlying data, and we send additional information to authors during the review process about the data policy. At accept, all data availability statements are checked for overall compliance with our policy, and we do a check of clinical data sets for potentially identifying information in case something was missed during review. And then post-publication, we'll follow up with authors as needed if we find that additional data are needed, or if something is missing. So the challenges that we've seen, so there have been challenges for authors, editors, and publishers, as we've talked about a bit already. So for authors, there are concerns about early sharing and scooping, tension between patient privacy issues and data sharing, also questions about which repositories to deposit to. For editors, there are questions about inconsistent checking of data by academic editors and reviewers, authors not providing sufficient data and metadata, and restrictions that are imposed by data consortia or institutions, regulatory bodies that may not be in compliance with our data policy. For publishers, challenges include unextractable data, proprietary file types, and also a question of how to cite data and ensure proper credit for data reuse. To address some of these challenges, we have done a number of things. So from the beginning, we've provided general guidelines for authors And we've updated those guidelines based on questions that we've gotten and to address some confusion that we've seen. We also have a list of FAQs that address questions that we have received about data sharing. For example, some of these FAQs address questions about proprietary data, confidential information or patient information, questions about studies that are looking at medical treatments that may be under review by regulatory bodies for approval. We also provide a list of recommended repositories, and this includes repositories for different data types as well as repositories in specific research areas. We have also worked to develop discipline-specific guidelines. So for instance, the editors of PLOS Genetics published an editorial discussing what they would expect authors to provide and their goal of obtaining functional utility for the data that's been deposited. We also have put together an external data advisory group that includes researchers in many different areas of science to help us trying to provide more guidance for authors in different scientific disciplines to help give them more information about what data we would expect to see. We've also continued the discussion about data-related issues in editorials and perspective pieces published in PLOS Medicine and PLOS Biology, for instance. And these discuss issues, our aspirations for the future, perspectives from the pharmaceutical industry, piece talking about intellectual property and ownership of data. Also a piece talking or addressing the concern about being scooped, or how often are other researchers using data from large data sets that have been deposited. Let's see. So we have seen what one of our editors termed a real sea change in people's attitudes since the time we implemented the data policy. So for instance, we've heard from academic editors and one academic editor in particular that making the data available at the time of submission is a logical and reasonable requirement. This is a quote from an author who said this is the first time that they have been required to provide a data spreadsheet alongside the manuscript, and they found a real benefit to doing this. And in fact, they discovered some errors that needed to be corrected before publication. And they said that they, in the future, even if they weren't asked to provide underlying data, that they would put together a similar data set for themselves just to go through this exercise again. There was a statistics course instructor for clinical research who chose, who during the course was talking about the difficulty of being able to evaluate whether authors have used the correct statistical analysis because data aren't available, but then picked a paper from PLOS ONE and said the reason the paper was chosen was that the actual data values in spreadsheet format are available from the PLOS ONE website. And he was able to download this and show that you could look at the data yourself, reanalyze it, and show that the authors used the correct statistical test. We've also been contacted by data repositories who want to ensure that they are in compliance with the rules and expectations of our journal. And finally, we've seen authors who have uploaded data to their papers even though they were published before our open data policy was implemented. This is an example just from a couple weeks ago where an author of a PLOS Biology paper uploaded his data. So there are many questions that remain. How long should people store data? How much data are needed to replicate? How should data be licensed and attributed? Questions about materials, software and code. What do we do with big data? How do we align consenting procedures for patient studies to allow for more data sharing? What are best practices for data access committees? How do we ensure the preservation of obsolete formats? And again, how should data be cited and authors credited? And luckily, there are many groups thinking about these issues, which we've already heard about a little bit. There are several journals that are focused on publishing data specifically. And in fact, one anecdote is that soon after our data policy was implemented, we had authors with a huge data set, and the academic editor really wanted to work with them to deposit that data set. And so we ended up working with GigaScience, and the authors deposited their data or published their data through GigaScience, and then published their analysis in PLOS ONE. So for them, it ended up being a win-win. They had a publication in GigaScience with the data and a publication in PLOS ONE. So with that, I just wanted to say that PLOS, as a nonprofit publisher and an advocacy organization, feel that open access results are just the beginning, and we've found that just by asking for data availability statement, we have seen a significant increase in open data sharing. And I just want to thank some of the people who were involved or contributed to this talk. And with that, I leave it for questions. So.
All right, thanks, Megan. We've got some good questions, and so I want to jump into those while we have time. First, there's just a quick question. What is the RDA that was mentioned by Brooks? That's the Research Data Alliance. And I wanted to stress them. You mentioned COPDES, you mentioned the TOP guidelines, and Force 11 was mentioned by all. And I think those are really key places. If you're trying to put together a data policy or write new instructions for authors, the more we can adhere to standards, and so every journal sort of requires very similar things, I think that just makes an easier path for researchers. Are there any other resources that weren't mentioned that either of you want to bring up? All right, sounds like those are the key ones. One of the questions, big picture question from Stuart Wills came in was, that the idea of data services is somewhat nebulous, but there's clearly an opportunity here, both in terms of service and in terms of business. So his question was, are there any comments on that idea? What are where the current environment suggests that opportunities might lie? It's sort of what role can a publisher play here? What's available for us to do here? So thoughts on the big picture from you both.
So this is Brooks. So I'm not completely sure. You mean so business opportunities around data? Is that part of the question?
Yeah, I think so. He says at the time the industry is seeking new ways to find revenue as old models mature and come under new competition, and there's a clear need here. So a suggestion: are there business opportunities for a publisher?
So I think, let me say a couple things. First of all, I think one of the things we didn't talk about well enough is that how we fund repositories long term is a major challenge. And my own view is that there's going to be a lot of funding models, whether it's institutional support like happens at GenBank, or there's other repositories that are subscription-based that are emerging, or it's a Dryad based model with deposition fees, or that there might be usage fees. Or what journals now have for publication fees or color fees may be turned into a curation fee that is distributed to whatever repository. So I think that's one outstanding question that's related to funding. There are, so at AGU, I mentioned we've started the two data services aimed at both repositories and training for scientists, and we don't expect to get a lot of revenue for either one, but given that we are trying to recover the costs of those services, so there can be revenue opportunities elsewhere about training or certification of scientists. The American Chemical Society, for example, has a variety of revenue generating streams related to certification, and so do other societies. So it's certainly something we're exploring. I think I should say most societies are not in the have not been in the data repository business themselves. At least at AGU, we feel that the community-based repositories, we want to support them, and that for a variety of reasons that that distributed network is better.
Yeah, I think that's a big question of, is this something, is this just part of the research paper, or is this something separate that the research paper will point out to? I think it's still, I think we're going to have to put this into practice and see what happens. Though I have heard the phrase, data is the new color charge, which was an interesting statement. Question came in, Megan, does the data availability statement take the place of putting the data in a reference?
No, so that's the data availability statement talks about the location of the data that underlies the results in that particular paper. Now, if authors were using another data set or referencing another data set, it would be appropriate for them to cite that in the references. I guess that might refer to the case of whether if authors have obtained data from a third party. That might be the most relevant. In that case, it would be included in the data availability statement and in the references as well.
So I mean, my understanding is that people really want, and a lot of the best practices are that they want the actual data set itself with its DOI cited in the paper and listed in the references, even in the paper that is describing that data set itself. And I think the reasoning for that is there are a lot of systems that are sort of automated that are out there looking for data sets, and we want to give credit for making this data available. So I know Thomson Reuters, for example, has a sort of data citation index that they're working on. And if you just, and I was told, so I was working with the journal, they said, all right, we'll put this little box on here and says the data set's available here. And what I was told is that's not adequate. You actually really want to have it in the citations itself, because it just makes it so much more findable, and to sort of drive that as a standard. So I think that's so that's something to think about.
Yeah, that's part of the best citation practices guidelines, is that they should be in the references for all the reasons you suggest. So it's machine readable, it's linkable, it's discoverable easily, and so forth. That doesn't preclude it also being included as metadata as PLOS ONE and PLOS and other journals do it.
Right. So I mean, so our solution is we're still going to have that box that says the data is available here, but we're also going to plug it into the references as well. One question came in. Brooks mentioned peer review systems that are incorporating data into the peer review process. So the question was asking about vendors that offer that as a service, but I think also it sort of raises that questions of can we expect peer reviewers to actually go deeply into the data? It's hard enough to find peer reviewers now. Is this a reasonable request?
So a variety of vendors are putting it in if the journals ask for it. So, for example, the Nature model is, or what Nature is doing, is they are requiring use of repositories that provide that embargoed access to data for the reviewers during the review process, and by including a metadata link or a link in the paper, the reviewers can access that data directly. So my experience as a reviewers is that some will and some don't, and part of certainly if a question is raised by a reviewer, they're looking at the figure or so forth, and they have a number of questions, having the data there greatly simplifies that access. I've seen a lot of reviewers in the pre-access days who said, I'm confused about this, can I see the raw data, or can I have access to the data? So certainly having that link and having that available improves the whole review process. Whether every reviewer will do it, we can certainly ask them about that. But often you're selecting some reviewers with that in mind, but maybe other reviewers, given the complexity of papers, I don't expect every reviewer will look at every data set or may not have expertise in every data set.
Megan, any thoughts on what you've seen as far as peer reviewers?
Yeah, I agree. There's a variability in what reviewers will consider, and that may depend on the particular study as well. For PLOS ONE, we include a specific question in our review form about data, and the data availability statement is available at the top of the PDF that's sent out for review, so that information is readily available to reviewers. And I also think that just what we've seen is just an increasing interest in the underlying data. We've seen more reviewers asking about data. So I think as people see the benefits to having the data available and being able to evaluate that as part of the review process, the more pickup we'll see as well.
Yeah, so we work with Dryad, and part of their service is that if you deposit the data upon submission, it can be held confidentially and made available through a private link to peer reviewers. So I know that's one vendor that offers it. And GigaScience is a journal you mentioned that will bring in 2 peer reviewers for the paper and a 3rd peer reviewer who is just reviewing the data set. So that's another way to approach that as well. Big picture question came in. What are the incentives for authors to participate in open data? I mean, I can say that, authors may be required to do that to retain their funding. It's just as a practical matter. But big picture is
so
it's good for science. Yeah.
It's good for science. I think it's good. It's increasingly being shown as good for the authors. It's there's many examples of where it's developed collaborations, where it's led to fundamental new science. The Kepler example I gave is one. The Kepler Space Telescope was looking at extrasolar planets, but as part of doing this, they were getting a whole other information on the stars that were hosting those extrasolar planets, and releasing that data pretty much opened up. It really accelerated a field of understanding those stars and that stellar evolution from the type of data that they're getting. So, and some of that led to new collaborations. I think there's a very good public, not public relations, but public communications and public importance for the integrity of science for doing that, so that it's good from that point of view as well.
Yeah, and in an era when we're having this crisis of confidence in research, it certainly adds to reputation and trust in someone's paper.
And I think increasingly scientists and researchers will get credit for data sets, and which is part of the reason for including them in citations. And recognition, career recognition for that.
Yeah, I agree with all of those things.
All right. There was a quick question. Does that mean putting the GenBank accession number in the reference list? I think that's a separate issue than having a data set with the DOI.
Yes, I think it depends on the particular case. If there's a separate description of or data paper related to that sequence, then that would be cited in the references.
Okay.
And whether GenBank starts giving DOIs or not, that's I think that's a question for GenBank.
Okay. I suspect we're up against the time limits here. We have a question in as are the slides from the speakers available? Jennifer, Tim, can you speak to that, and do you want to wrap things up with housekeeping?
Yes. Thank you, David. Yes, we will be sending out the slides and an evaluation after the webinar, along with the recording. So thank you, Michael and David, for moderating today, and thank you, Brooks and Megan, for sharing your insights with us as well. Thanks to all of you listening to the webinar, for attending today. As you see in your screen there, please join us for the next SSP webinar on September 13th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Content versus Container, How Online Delivery is Changing the Process of Acquiring and Managing Content. This will be moderated by Tom Byers from Pub Factory and Elizabeth Demers, Senior Acquisitions Editor for History and American Studies at Johns Hopkins University Press. And with that, we are concluded. Enjoy the rest of your day.